Yes.
Generally, like, since you cannot create, say, like, I push my database to OpenShift, and then it's a blank database, right?
Yes.
How do I create an admin user in OpenShift?
So, couple ways. You use RockMongo. RockMongo is a separate gear. That's a client. It's a MongoDB client. It's web-based. So you can look at all the data. Yeah, it's when you go in, you have two gears now, right? You have the Node.js gear, you have the MongoDB gear. You can install a third gear, and and you can choose RockMongo. I think it's one of the options that it gives you. It'll also offer you to install the RockMongo. Or, I'm sorry?
It's kind of like a UI.
Yeah, it's UI. So you'll need to go to MongoDB and configuration, and it'll ask for username and password. So it's in the MongoDB configuration. The other one is you can create a fake like root user that has admin, and that's always username that always has admin, but then it has a default password that you're meant to change right away. Yeah.
Okay. Let's continue. Let's see. So we are in our last lecture week, week 14, and so next week we won't have lectures. I'll start grading on the 19th, and so the grade is random, meaning I'll choose a list of the students and I'll randomize it, and I'll start grading in that order. So I suggest you keep working even after the 19th. You might be the last one who's graded, so you would have on average you should all be a whole week now up until at least April 22nd to keep working on your project, right? Statistical analysis said you would be somewhere in the middle, right? So you should keep working. I'm going to send out a form for Eric to fill out to make sure that you give me your the URL to your OpenShift, again, to your Git, everything. Ask you is for a text, for a phone where I can text you. And you will receive a text right before we start grading you. So you should keep working up until you get that text, which would be towards the end of April. Yes?
Is the text like a 2-hour warning, or is it?
I'll try and do it the day before.
Okay.
But I can't guarantee that. It's going to be very hectic the next 2 weeks for all of us to be creating this. But basically, what you should do is that everything that's in GitHub should always be demoable, right? It should be at a stable state that we should always be able to pull it down and run it on our local machines. Okay. So don't push anything in GitHub that would break your project. Always have it at stable, and as you and upgrades, just push them, right? So that it's always up to date, so that if you get that text, you're happy that what's there, should be okay. All right?
Is that the whole page as well?
Yeah. Typically what we'll do is that we'll divvy it up. We'll have some TAs will be grading home pages, some TAs will be grading other things. So it might be a different schedule, but yes.
I was just asking about grading since I haven't yet, but I think that's just because I submitted the links like past the due date, but like my commit hash was like.
Yeah.
I was wondering.
Yeah. So basically when the first whole, project assignment went out, that asked you that you should have, you know, 2 types of users, it's several ones many, and those requirements are basically what we're going to be using to grade everything. So yeah, so there's a TA dedicated only for grading that portion. And a lot of folks had either had not provided a tag, right? Or some folks created the tag afterwards, after the TA had seen it. So if you have a tag, then you just let the TA know, and they'll be grading that particular tag.
Should I just make a piazza post about?
Yes. To instructors. Yes.
Does the homepage have like actual requirements?
It should look spectacular. The only real requirement that I have is that it has to have link to your project, your assignments, your GitHub, to your Google Docs, and basically you can do whatever you want. It should be pretty.
It doesn't have to be a single page.
No, it doesn't have to be a single page. You know, it should be something that I feel comfortable with us copying the link. If I look at this wow, then you have full credit. And it has those 4 links, 5 links, then you have the full 5%.
If you look at it, you're like, yeah.
Man, still fine. If it has those links, maybe 4. Okay. It's somewhat subjective, so please make it, you know, just very pretty. You can, a lot of people, what they're doing is they're using a template, one of these free templates there. Okay. But what I really need for each of us to grade is those links to the Google Doc, the GitHub, the OpenShift, the assignments, and the link to the project. Okay. Right, and then it looks beautiful. All right. All right, so we are at the last week, so we're looking at the last topic here, which is the dynamic server pages, using the particular technology called embedded JavaScript. Some of you might find this topic fairly familiar. A lot of you I know that have been working either with Python or have worked with PHP or Basic. And you should feel right at home when we look at this topic. Up to this point, we have been working on client-side applications. Right? We've been working on implementing single-page applications where the server has mostly been used for hosting static content, right? Hard-coded HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And then providing data through the use of APIs, web service API. Yes? Web applications, which really is mostly how web pages have been built since the web came alive. And it's using server-side technologies to render dynamic pages. So the architecture is a little bit different, and let me just draw up on the screen how are they different from what we've been building so far. Right. So up to this point, using AngularJS to create single-page applications, right? So the architecture has been the following. Browser here, right, requests a page typically an index page from a server. In this case, would be Node. And typically, what we have here is an index page that lives on the server, which is static, right? Index gets downloaded, and it gets copied on this index page. Then makes several other requests back to the server for other resources such as JavaScript, CS, and also makes requests out to the cloud as libraries. Once a year, the Angular takes over. Angular sees that it needs to navigate to certain routes and sees that it needs to go and fetch other HTML templates. It needs to fetch several controllers. The controllers run. So the controllers run inside of the browser using web services. They're going to go and fetch data from the server. Right? They're going to ask for data by using an API call. It says API, right? And they'll ask for something, right? And the data they get back is JSON. Right? They get JSON. Yes? Then Angular uses that JSON to dynamically render the DOM. Make sense? Right? Now, the web service here in Node typically will go through several steps. Right? Within Node, there'll be a web service. We'll go to Mongoose, right? And Mongoose will talk to Mongo database, right? This comes back as promises, and then the web service spits back JSON to the browser. Yes? Right, that's what we've been building for the last 3 months. So on server side, it's a little bit different. Server side, web server that have pages. Here, we still have the browser, and the browser is going to make a request to the server. And what we're going to do is that we're going to map this route. We're going to map it to a local file, right, that is no longer going to have the extension .html. Instead, it's going to have a different extension, right? It's going to have maybe it'll be index.ejs, JavaScript. Right? And what these files are mostly HTML, just like plain old HTML over here, but it's HTML that has embedded JavaScript in it. Okay? Embedded JavaScript code that is meant to execute here on the server. Okay, it executes here on the server, and when it's done, right, this URL is going to come back with fully rendered HTML tags, which are then rendered here by the browser. Right? So no longer are we going to have the architecture where the browser running some JSON, right? We're not going to have that. Instead, we're going to have on this side the entire logic running on the server, right, and then generating fully structured HTML. We can still create this philosophy or this architecture of web services and breaking it up into various pieces, but in here, what we're going to do is that we're going to have a handler coming to the URL, right? Handling the but the data, instead of sending it to as JSON like we did over here in single-page applications, instead of sending it for rendering at the client, instead we're going to send it to the EJS. I'm going to send it to EJS. Page, right? The EJS page is going to take this JSON because what comes back is JSON, right? when we query the database, what comes back is JSON. We feed it into the index. The index looks at that JSON object, does its rendering, uses a for loops or if-then statements and all sorts of logic to render that page, right? HTML, and then that gets streamed back to the client. So we've been working on for the last couple of months. So in Angular, we have MVC. Angular follows the MVC pattern. Is these templates, right? These are the templates, the views that are downloaded from here, and you have several of those, right? We have the home view and the profile view, a whole bunch of those, right? And when they're downloaded, they use local controllers that, as you click and drag and interact with the view, are handled by controllers on Angular. Yes. And then to client, and the model lives here. This whole thing is now the model that's providing the data that goes back to the controller, or then model to the view for rendering, right? So here the server has two tasks. One of them is provide the hard-coded HTML, right, the static content. But then after that, after having this hard-coded static content, it's basically just the model. It's just providing data. It's one big data source, right? Yes, right. Over here in this architecture, right, the MVC is pushed all the way back to the server, right? There is no. The front end here is only a dumb HTML. It's not doing any action. What happens is that the user clicks and drags, but those are all converted into requests, which are handled by a controller, right? You're gonna receive the events. The events as the user interacts with the page are converted into URL requests that are going to be handled by JavaScript, which is going to be receiving that URL, is going to be handling that event, is going to use the model, right? Here's the big model that goes and fetches data, and then sends it here to the view. So the view, the control, and the model are now going to live here they all live here in the server. And this was a classical way of building web applications for well over a decade. Okay, and it's still being built this way. Okay, if you're doing PHP or you're doing Java server pages or ASPs, this is a lot of the architecture is based on this organization of the application. And this is what I'd like to talk about today. Okay? Users have asked for more and more interactive applications. A lot of this view and the control, right, have migrated to the client, right, where we can have direct access or direct interaction the end user, right? So here the end user, as they interact with the view, they have an immediate way. They can immediately respond, right, in a much more responsive way to the user, as opposed to this one. Notice that each fetch of data means a complete re-render that gets downloaded and re-rendered on the browser. Whereas over here, the page never reloads, right? And we only strategically load and inject content strategically in different locations. Okay, so this game experience, right? Because each page is being reloaded and refreshed, as opposed to this one that gives you a more smoother interaction. Also, it doesn't mean that we have to go only this and or only that, right? It's not and have the best of both worlds. Okay. Well, first of all, what's best of each one? I've only said the bad things about this. Right? There's a couple good things as well. Here you have the benefit that you're running on a full-blown server machine, right? That oftentimes is, or could be, that is several orders of magnitude more powerful than yours. Okay. Instead of having your little laptop here computing and rendering this, over here you might have a fairly powerful machine that is accessing data and making use of a lot of cached resources, right? Resources that are shared among dozens of users that are using the same machine, right? So you can do a lot of caching, right, or pooling of the resources over here, which would give you a much better performance, right, than instead having to do, deal with each individual independently. Okay. Also, typically they're much faster than over here. Also, if you might have noticed that when you reload pages here on Angular, sometimes you see a flicker. That there's a lag between the time that the HTML arrives here, so the time that the browser parses your HTML, and the time that Angular parses the HTML. There's a lag, right? There's a couple milliseconds there where the templates have not been parsed yet by Angular, right? And you might see the brackets just for a split second, while Angular is still parsing and making sense out of the application. Here you don't see that at all because the HTML is fully rendered here on the build, right? And not until the HTML is fully baked, it's fully rendered, then it's downloaded by the browser, and there's no flicker whatsoever. Okay. So there's pros and cons for both of them. They complement each other very well. If you're looking at pages that need to perform very, very fast, but perhaps a little less dynamic, dynamic pages would be a better option. But this static HTML that comes here could then be itself an Angular application, right? Which could then take over the DOM and fetch other data. So, for instance, pages that need to come up in split nanoseconds or milliseconds. Those are typically server-side pages that maybe landing pages or splash screen performance. Those are server-side, or even static pages. That make sure that we get in front of our clients as fast as possible, right? Once the client has it is already on our site, and perhaps it's already a committed, better experience, a smoother experience using a combination of Angular, JS, and the client-side technologies. Make sense? All right. All right. Let's take a look at some of the lecture notes. I've added an additional and so I encourage you to read through this. All right, so we're going to be using EJS. EJS, as the acronym suggests, it stands for Embedded. Right. So this is going to be very familiar to those who have done PHP and and JSPs and ASPs. It's basically being able to embed executable code inside, interlaced with HTML, hard-coded static HTML. For this to work on your Node.js instance, you'll need to install the EJS package using npm install EJS. Don't forget dash save so that it makes an entry. An entry into your package JSON file, right? If it's not there, this might work locally on your machine, but it might not work remotely when you push it to your hosting environment. Once you've done that, you need to configure and tell Node.js that you want to use EJS as your rendering engine, as your templating engine. EJS by default uses a different rendering engine, uses Jade. Jade is a different templating engine. There's a whole bunch of them. There's quite a few templating engines. I'm using EJS since I come from Java and ASP, and it's much more from the syntax is much more familiar to me. But with all of them, you pretty much can do the same. Although some other templating engines are a little more powerful in that they allow you to use a pseudo HTML kind of syntax, right? That a complex HTML based on very simple shortcuts. Okay, it has a very small syntax, but it has a higher learning curve. I thought this was a nice, very easy way to learn. To be EJS instead of Jade. Right? So you set it by app.set view engine EJS. So if you do that, your pages, your index pages, and all your dynamic content is not going to live under the public directory. So we're not going to use the directory for this type of content. Instead, they live you can change it. You put it, but by default, they live under your views folder. So right where public is, right, that contains all your HTML, yes, all that. Well, right there as a sibling, create a views directory, right? And it has to have that name. That's the default name that EJS module expects. Okay, so under there, we will be putting all our EJS pages. So here we're going to have index.ejs, right, or home.ejs, profile EJS. Obviously, we can organize it into folders, just like we did for the Angular views. Same thing. Anyway, once you have those views, hello world or home or welcome or your profile page, we need to map them and say, hey, if you're looking for this page, this is what I'm going to give you, right? We need to create what are the equivalent of controllers, right? Remember, the events in Angular are being handled by controllers that run on the client, on the browser, yes? We're not going to have that anymore when we're using EJS, right? Instead, those events are going to be actual, when you click on, when they click on a hyperlink or a button, they're actually going to be URLs that are going to come to the server, right? And those are going to be events that are going to be handled by the server. So we're going to create here in the node modules, we're going to create controllers, right? They're going to receive the events as you click and drag and do and interact. To our API web services. They're going to be very, very similar, right? They're going to have the same app.get, app.post, app.put, app.delete, right? So, for instance, here's one of them. We've created here an event handler, right, that listens for an incoming /page request, right? So this is HTTP, localhost, yada, 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 3000 /page, right? And this is in a module that's going to be listening for these incoming requests. Right? Who's going to handle that? A page controller. Now remember, these are not the same controllers we have been working with in Angular controllers, right? These are controllers that live on the server, right? That listen for this incoming event, right? That the user generated either by clicking on a hyperlink or something, right? So this page controller, and the reason I'm saying that this is a controller as opposed to as an HTTP handler, right, is that it's going to take the goal of what controllers do. What do controllers do? They map they go fetch the data that views need, right? Go maybe query a database or something from a web service or whatever. Grab the data and then feed the data to some view, and then the view renders that content. User generated events, manipulates the model or fetches the data, and then provides the view for rendering. And here it is. Here's a very simple. Here's a very simple controller. The only thing that it does is that it just automatically just says, "Oh, this is the view. This is the view that should render this event." Okay. So the way it does it is using this new function that we're introducing today, calling the render function. The render function. So render, right, is a function that is added there by the template engine. In our case, EJS. EJS adds that to the server, to the client, to the browser, is that this page, this dynamic server page that lives under the views, right? It should render this page. Okay. And whatever HTML is in there, whatever JavaScript is in there, it should execute. And whatever HTML it generates, that's what's going to be sent back to the browser. Now, here, the view or the template is called page. So presumably, that maps to a file that lives under the views directory called page.ejs. Okay? This extension is optional. It's understood that that's the file. Okay. So in that page, EJS, we might have something like this, right? Where most of the content is just plain old HTML, right? And in there, we can have optional JavaScript, embedded JavaScript code. Here we have a very simple piece of code that creates a local variable called hello, and then it renders that hello world for the browser. Okay. Now notice that we're introducing this new character sequence, the less than %, right? This is a templating language, right? That EJS introduces that allows you to escape certain things, so that you can determine what is static HTML and what is dynamic content. Okay, anything in this sequence of character less than or % means that this is dynamic, right? None of this is going to make it to the browser. Right? This is a code that executes on the server, right? And that it does not generate any HTML back to the server, back to the client. Whereas this one over here, notice that the character sequence is a little bit different. Notice that it has an equal here. See that? That equal says evaluate value of whatever that variable is, whatever that evaluates to. This entire template here, replace it by whatever hello renders. Okay, make sense? All right, so it's a very, very simple template. You don't need to have any of this in here, right? It could all be just plain old HTML. That's okay, right? So anything outside of this less than 1% is considered to be hard-coded static text, right? Anything inside of the sequence, right, is interpreted to be executable JavaScript. All right. Okay. Now, unlike Angular, where we also have templating engines in Angular, right? The templating is using curly brackets instead, right? And here we're using less than a percentage. Now, on Angular, that code, those templates, right? That is downloaded, and you can actually look at that code, right? You can look at you can look at the original page source, and you will see Angular templates in there, interspersed in there, right? Those that have not been replaced, they will be replaced in the DOM by the Angular JavaScript. Here, these templates don't make it to the browser. So the browser, the end user will never see the source code, right? Because all of this will execute on the server, will be replaced by empty strings or whatever they evaluate to, and that's what makes it to the server. Make sense? See the difference? Right? On the Angular side, you get to see the logic for the layout logic at least. Typically, we build complex applications in terms of smaller pieces of other smaller templates. And in EJS, we could do the same thing using the include template, right? That allows us to dynamically load other templates, right? So here we have included here another page that presumably just has hard-coded links, right? All the CSS, all the CSS, that's content, right, across all pages. Right? So instead of loading it, it's pasting that content here. It's better to have it in a common place so that all pages get it. Okay? So this improves the reusability of code, right, and modularization, so that you have a single place of maintenance for all this content. But this is not. This is a little bit different the way Angular does it, because in Angular we're using single page applications, right? We load it in the index page, and then we never load the index page ever again, right? We then use ng-route and ng-views to inject the rest of the content strategically, but that portion never gets reloaded. Here is a little bit different. Okay, we don't have an EJS that way of laying out pages and injecting content dynamically throughout the routes. Instead, the reusability happens at each page. So each page profile and admin and home, and they all will have this include, right? They all have this include. So each one is including these pages, this content dynamically, but then when it to the browser, it'll include the 20 libraries that expanded all the way, right? And that's what makes it to the client, which is pretty expensive, right? Because the client is seeing for the profiles, it's downloading all this HTML, and for the admin, it's also downloading this entire HTML, right? Which includes this header at the top, right? So it's a little less efficient, right? Because from page to downloading the whole thing, right? HTML and the header and all these links and all this script, right? Obviously, the browser is smart and is caching all this content, so it's not going off and loading and downloading all these libraries. But you notice how it's a little bit less efficient. All this redundant HTML being downloaded over and over and over as you navigate from one page to the next, right? You do have some optimization for us developers, right? This allows us to modularize our development. For the transfer of the HTML back and forth is less efficient. Okay. And yeah, so here's my link, my head link EJS page, right? That just contains all the links. We could do the same things for the header, for the JavaScript. It's going to be downloaded it's being shared among several pages. Parsing, you're passing data from the as the user clicks through the URLs. They can provide data to the EJS very similar to the way we're using APIs, right? We've only seen this being used in APIs, right? Where we have either jQuery Ajax or Angular web service on the client services generating these URLs that go and fetch JSON. Here, it's different, right? From the service point of view, it's the same, right? It's just a URL with parameters. Typically, it will be generated not by a client web service. Typically, it will be generated by a user clicking on a hyperlink, right? And a user actually clicking on a hyperlink and generating this GET request. In that respect, it's different, right? Remember, we are here. The user is clicking on these URLs and generating these events, right? That the control, as opposed to us clicking and handling the ng click here in the controller, right? And then generating a web service client request for data for rendering. No. We're going to a server, and the server reads that hyperlink and can extract parameters just like we did with APIs, right? This is not an API. Yes, notice that it doesn't have API in front of it, /API. This is not meant to use on data. Yes, very important to make the distinction here. Okay. Yeah, so it's being handled by the page controller. The mechanism for retrieving data is just the same, right? These are path parameters. They're parameters in the path, right? We retrieve them just through the request.params map, right? That Express has parsed from the URL. Once we have that data to our templates, right? Remember, the rendering is going to be done by our EJS, right? So these are our EJS templates. Data, and then we're going to feed the data to the templates, and then the template is going to use that data to render the page, and then it will generate dynamic HTML that goes to the client. Yeah, right. In that sense, that's exactly what a controller does, right? It gets data, it massages that data, and then it provides that data to the view for rendering. The view and the controller, they both live on the server side. Yes. As opposed to the client like we've been doing for the last couple of months. So there it is. So we extracted the data from the request. We didn't do a database access this time around, but we'll do that in a minute. I just want to show you how do we package the data so we can give it to the view. So there it is. We're going to create a map, a data map. Doesn't really matter what you call it. It doesn't mean this name doesn't matter. But to pass it to a view, we use the same render function we used earlier, right? But with the added parameter of the data map that contains all the data. Now, the page EJS template can access all the variables, all the data that live in that map. Right? It's going to use these names as keys to retrieve the data that we put in that data map. Right? So here's the inside of the EJS, for instance. These two properties in the data map. These are the keys of the values, right? We can use these keys to from within the template using the escape sequence less than % equal, less than % equal. Right? That evaluates the value of that variable and it replaces the entire character sequence. Make sense? Right? We can pass data. So we've seen a couple of these. We've seen a couple of these. There's several of these character sequence. This one we've seen earlier. We've used it for declaring variables, right? But in that character sequence, less than %, you can put any valid JavaScript code, right? That might include declaring variables, math arithmetics. You can do for loops, if statements, switch case, any executable JavaScript snippet of code. And this is code that is running on the server. You can do access to file system. You can do database connection, database access. But even though you have full-blown control and access to all these libraries, you shouldn't. Views are meant to do what views do, right? They're meant to just render content, right? The data access should not be done by the view, even though it can. It has access to all those libraries, right? But it should not practice for views to do any of this. Instead, all the data should be provided by the controller. The controller is responsible for fetching the data and massaging it and grabbing it and then providing it to the view for rendering. So yeah, so the control is flow is for doing if statements and for loops and whatnot. This one, the ones we've seen just in the previous slide, is just evaluating an expression and replacing the value of that expression in line with the rest of the content. Now that character sequence interprets the data that it's going to render. If, for instance, that the data, the variable that it's going to evaluate is just plain string, it will evaluate just the plain string. But if that string contains special characters, such as HTML content or JSON content, right, as a particular format, right, this will escape it. It will escape the content. So for instance, if that variable or that expression returns a valid HTML string, right, it will render as plain text, right? It will be escaped. So for instance, all the less than and greater than will be escaped. You will see the greater than and less than. You'll see the tags as opposed to HTML. So it's escaped. If you want to unescape it, meaning you want the raw, if that variable evaluates to valid HTML, I want it to render as HTML. I want the browser to look at this, right, and actually render it, right? So you can unescape it and use the minus in front of it, meaning do not interpret this. Do not interpret it. It is for the browser to interpret. Don't EJS. Do not interpret this. It's for the browser. By default, all of these guys, right? All of these add a new line at the end. Once they is evaluated, right? It is replaced. It adds a new line at the end of that percent greater than. It adds a new line after this right here. If you don't want that new line, you can add at the end this minus, this dash at the end, so that it does not add that. Okay. Also, if the content that generates has all sorts of white spaces, such as tabs, new line, character terms, or just plain old, by using the underscores before and after. If you don't like the less than percent less than, override that. It says, hey, you know what? I really like the way Angular does it. If you like the curly brackets, then you can use that instead. You can use that escape sequence instead of the less than percent. Okay, that's in EJS.
So,
yes.
if you wanted to include client-side JavaScript in the browser, you have to escape it, or can it just be embedded in the actual?
No, if it's included, it'll put it verbatim, so you don't have to unscape it.
Okay, so the only thing EJS will interpret
is HTML. So if you have HTML,
right,
and you mean that HTML might include other stuff in there?
right, browser JavaScript.
Yeah.
EJS won't interpret.
No. So wait a minute. So this is if it's an expression, right? If you put a variable here, if you put a variable in there, and that variable evaluates to HTML,
right,
it will interpret it. EJS will interpret it, and it will escape it by default. So no JavaScript, no HTML, no nothing, right? If you instead don't want to interpret it, then you put the dash, right? Now, if you're including a file that has JavaScript, that has whatever, right? You can just use include.
Okay.
So include will be replaced with whatever the content uninterpreted. Okay. All right. Okay, so here's an example where this controller, the page controller, right, has parsed these parameters from the URL, and now we want to use those parameters to a database. I have these parameters. I want to fetch some data, and so we can use just plain old model, just like we've been doing for the last couple of weeks, right? We use a model where we can retrieve a particular piece of data from the database, and once we have it, we still have to use the same syntax of promises, like we've been doing so far, just like we've been doing in web services, right? We're using the page model to retrieve data. In this case, it's not the web service who's doing this, right? We call it now a controller, but it's the same thing as a web service. It's the same exact thing, right? It's just that we've moved, right, the architecture of control and views, right, and we've pushed it back into the server side, right? So that now actually, these are clicks, right? And users clicking on hyperlinks, and they're generating all these events. So in that sense, this is behaving like a controller. Fetching data. Once it has data, a page object. This is a mongoose object that came back from the database. We can make it part of the data model of the data map that we then pass to the template for rendering. Right? If you remember from the examples from last week, a page object represents a collection of widgets. That's the web app maker application I've been working for the last couple of weeks, right? A page is a collection of widgets. There's a whole bunch of widgets, right? There's a YouTube widget, there's image widgets, there's buttons and full WYSIWYG editors. Remember that? And we've been working on that. I've been working on that for the last couple of weeks. So I pass it to the template for rendering. So in there, in the template, I can take the page. Oh, this is it's an alarm. Take some medication. So from within my templates, I can refer to any of the objects, right, that I had put in my data map that I had passed along to for rendering. I can refer to them just by name, right? I can refer to them by name. So here I can access the full-blown JSON object that was passed to me they now become part of the context of the template. So if you remember, page contained widgets, right? And there are a whole bunch of types of widgets. So here, notice that we're using a for loop, right? Notice that we have this portion right here is JavaScript, and then we switch back into HTML, then back into Java. That's why the delimiters allow you to move in and out of JavaScript, right? And then back into HTML, and then back into JavaScript, and then back into HTML. That's why the delimiter. So the way this is read is that we're going to iterate, and as we iterate, notice the open curly brackets here, and notice the right? We're going to iterate, and as we iterate, we're going to create all these divs, one per widget in the page. See that? And as we are rendering, we're going to evaluate object, and it renders in the as JSON objects. So you can look at the actual JSON object that we would want to render there. Okay, that makes sense, right? But what we want to do is depending on the type of the widget, we would like to be able to render different things, right? And now, the way we did this in Angular is that we had one big ngIf. Ng switch, and that it compared the type of the widget, and then if it was a label, we had an ng switch when, right, that rendered a label. And when it said an ng switch for a YouTube widget, it would render. We have an ng switch when for a YouTube widget, right? You have this huge, you know, if else, right? It's like a switch case, right? One big switch case. Over here, I wanted to do something a little more sophisticated. Instead, what I did has a type in it, right? It has a widget type attribute that tells me what type it is, right? It's the same data that we were using in Angular for the switch case, right? For the ng switch, we were doing switch, widget, and the widget type. Yes. And depending on the type, we would render headers or labels or input fields or YouTube widgets or images and whatnot, right? Here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the name, I'm going to take that widget type, and I'm going to use it to render different templates. Okay? So I'm going to create several templates under my views directory. So under my views directory, okay, I'm going to create a EJS. I'm going to create a label EJS. I'm going to create a YouTube EJS. So for each one of the widgets, I'm going to have a dedicated template. And I want to load it, right? Okay? So this is very powerful, right? Being able to load various types of content depending on a variable. So let's see how we do that. So we're going to load a dynamic template. So as I iterate, notice that it's the same code as earlier. Over the page widgets, I'm going to extract the type of the widget, right? Once I have the widget type, I'm going to transform it all to lowercase, right? Because all my templates are lowercase, right? Now all caps header. Now it's going to be all lowercase header, right? Or all lowercase label or YouTube or image or text input. There's a whole bunch of them, right? And now the template I'm going to use, is the one that's under widgets and then the template name. See that? Now that I know the name of the template I'm going to use, I'm going to use include. And include is going to load one or another. But notice how different this is. Before, it was include, and then space, and then a hard-coded a URL or path file. Right? This is a little bit different. Here, I'm using the a variable template I want to load. See that? That's different than what we did earlier. Okay, in the previous include, in this include, you'll notice that I didn't use parentheses. See that? That means that this is a hard-coded, it's not a variable. Right, and it cannot change. It's that's the only value. If instead I am calculating in a variable what I want to load, I need to use this different syntax. I need to use parentheses. See the parentheses? And then use that as the name of the template to load it. Right? Very, very powerful. That you can load various types of content dynamically based on a particular logic. Also, oh no, that's it. So we always encourage you to comment, use good commenting practice of your source code, but maybe it's that those comments are only meant for the developers, whoever's building the website. They're not meant for anyone else. Okay, so instead of using the classical comments, HTML comments, such as the bang dash dash, these are comments that are hard-coded comments that are going to be available and viewable by the end user, right? Whoever wants to look at the page source. Many of these comments are only meaningful to the developer who's developing the website. So to do that and create comments, but remove them from the end of HTML so they don't make it into the final sequence for the comments. Okay. All right. So we've loaded dynamic widgets by name with a variable. We can also once we include a template, we can pass it. We can pass it data, right? So we're loading the templates dynamically, and we can pass it along data that is that template will need. So for instance, here I'm grabbing a particular widget object, right, from the array, and then passing that widget JSON object down to the template, right? And then from within that template, I will render different things, right? If this is a YouTube widget, I'll take a look at whatever's under the YouTube namespace, right? If this is a label or header, or depending on what widget I am, So let's look at one of the simplest widgets. Let's look at one of the simplest widgets. The simplest widget, it was the header widget, right? The header widget was a widget that, depending on the size that the developer configured, it would render different size headers, right? It could render as heading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Depending on what the developer chose in their properties sheet. Yes, the configuration. So here, the way I implemented it is that my header.ejs, which is being included by the page EJS. The developer doesn't have to provide a size, right? It's optional. They don't have to provide a size, so that it would be a default size of 2. Remember that was the default size of the header. So I checked to see if the widget object that was passed, the page.ejs passed it when this template was included. It passed this along, right? And in there, I have things such as header in there, right, or label, or YouTube, or whatever, depending on the type of the widget. If I'm a header widget, there should be a header object in there. I first check to see if it is. If it's not, I initialize it to be a 2, right? And then notice, remember, anything outside of the less than %, anything outside of that is what? Static HTML, right? Static text. So I start off with the opening tag. See that? Less than H. And then after the A or 4, right? I can dynamically calculate what this is based on the size of the header of the widget, right? So that will render either 1, 2, 3, 4, or by default it will be a 2, right? And then I close, and here's my opening H tag, and then I have a matching closing H tag. See that? Right? Again, being dynamically rendered in there, and any text in the header that has been provided by the developer will show here in the header. Very, very nice. Okay. All right. You can also, so I mean, remember, anything in here is just dynamic, and we happen to be generating dynamic HTML, right? That's mostly what we're using it, and that's what mostly we use EJS for, dynamic HTML rendering. But it doesn't have to be just HTML, right? Because outside of the escape characters, right now we're using HTML, but it could be anything. It could be dynamic JSON, or it could be dynamic XML, or dynamic. If we know the syntax of whatever MIME type we want to generate, we could generate the sequence of characters, right, or character codes that we need to generate any type of document, right? We could generate dynamic documents, right? If we just knew what the syntax or whatever the proprietary data model for those types of content, and the proper MIME type, right? So that when it gets by the browser will know, how to render it for you. We're using the escape characters to the templates to embed values for attributes in this particular case, I think it's an input text or text input widget that can either render as an input or text area or as a full-blown text angular WYSIWYG editor. And here's another example on of embedding templates inside of a larger attribute, in this case the href attribute, and the URL is being dynamically rendered using EJS. Very, very powerful. So that means that the URLs, the links that the user is clicking on, those are generated URLs, right? So we are telling the control over how the interaction behaves. Here's another example where we are dynamically, right, calculating a class. Look at this, right? In the class attribute, right, we dynamically generate the button class to render this either blue or green or yellow or red, right? Here's another example of using an if, so that depending on the type of the widget, whether it's formatted or if it's formatted, we were going to use text angular. If it's not formatted, depending on whether we have rows or not, we either use a regular input field or area. Here's remember I said earlier that it doesn't need to be just only EJS server-side pages or client-side JavaScript, right? It could be a mixture, right? You could have the best of both worlds. You can have a server-side dynamic pages and also client-side dynamic pages, right? Where one of them is rendered entirely on the server, right? And then when this is server, it can then have libraries that are asking for Angular and jQuery and other libraries that can then take over and continue the manipulation of the DOM. So here's an example where we're sending over from the server, right? Has an ng app in there. Look at that. See that? So so this would be a way for these two worlds to coexist, right? I generate dynamically HTML that then becomes a dynamic Angular application, right? You could, right up to this point, I've been working on Web App Maker, right? And in such a way that I'm using Angular as my application that allows me to build EJS applications, right? Server-side application. So Angular application allows me to build server-side application, right? But it could be the other way around. I could have an EJS application that allows me to build dynamic Angular applications. So you have like an editor, right, an IDE, where you can configure routes, you can configure controllers and directives and all sorts of things that you need in an Angular application. So anyway, so here's my EJS sending back a Web App Maker ng app, and in the I created a separate template called head script, right? That goes in the head. That I'm going to put in the commons directory because this is something that's going to be loaded for every single page. And routes and the autocomplete and all the directives, the text Angular, and here's the start of the Angular module, right? Is an Angular application. Again, rendered dynamically from the server. Pretty cool. YouTube. Now, the YouTube widget, right, if the widget is of type YouTube, if you remember, the URL it's a page that hosts the video on YouTube, right? That's what we ask users to copy and paste inside of our application. And in Angular, we use that URL to build. And then that embed URL, right, based on the YouTube ID, we could then use it. We could then use it as data to inject in the source of the iframe. Remember that? Okay. Now, in Angular, we had a problem when we tried to do that. Render dynamic iframe, a dynamic iframe. So that's considered unsafe from the Angular's point of view. But we're not using Angular to render this, right? This is all being executed on the server side. Angular has no idea of this HTML whatsoever, right? So on the server side, we don't have those concerns. You know, as far as the browser is concerned, they're just going to get a hard-coded iframe with a hard-coded URL, right? But when it gets to the browser, this will have been evaluated, and the stream that goes back to the browser we won't have any of it, right? This will be a hard-coded HTML. So it would be the responsibility of the server to decide whether this is safe, right, for the client to be rendered on the client, whether we trust this iframe. But we know we trust you, right? That we're embedding something from YouTube, so there is no concern here of using a special mechanism to escape any of this, right? So we don't have those concerns. Those were only Angular concerns. Yes? Concerns. Images, same thing with the images. In Angular, right, because the order in which the DOM is generated, right, remember, first the browser gets a look at the document, right? The browser looks at the HTML and starts parsing it, and as it parses, as it identifies other resources that it needs, such as other JavaScript that it needs, CSS files, any images that it needs, right? As it's parsing, all these other things. So, and as it receives these responses, it will start to just keep rendering the page, right? So in Angular, when we and the browser, when it looked at the variable, it says this is an invalid URL, right? I can't find this image, and we would get, you know, a whole bunch of error messages in the console, right, saying I can't find this image, can't find, right? So the way around that in Angular was to not use SRC attribute. Instead, we would use the ng source. Yes, that's the way around it. And so that's why Angular didn't stop complaining, right? Because not Angular, sorry, the browser stopped complaining. The browser, when it parsed this image tag, it saw that it didn't have an SRC attribute, so it didn't try to download the image. Instead, what ng source, ng SRC did is that after Angular took a look at this, and once Angular had a value for this URL, then it would start downloading. But now we're not using Angular, right? We're not using JavaScript to do any of this, right? Well, we're not using client-side technology, right? We're using server-side dynamic content. So when the HTML here is being rendered, the value of this will be will be determined. It will be used as a hard-coded URL for the source, right? And then when it starts as just one hard-coded HTML a link, right, to a real image, hopefully, and it will not complain. So no need to do ng source, right? Just source is plenty. Of iterating over tabular data, perhaps either an array of arrays or objects that contain other objects, right? In this case, I believe it's objects that contain objects. Let me see. Of a data table, and those fields are being used to render the header, right? So it's basically iterating over the names of the fields in an array of fields, right? So that generates the header, the first row with all the names of the columns. Then we iterate over the data in the data table, which is the rows of the data, right? And in there, so that's going to generate a whole bunch of TRs. See that? Notice that we're not using ng repeat, right? We're not in Angular world, right? We're not using any of that. We're using just plain old JavaScript. Yes? Plain old JavaScript to iterate over several TRs. Then for each record, we want to not only do we want to iterate vertically for the table rows, we also want to iterate horizontally for each one of the values in the record, right? And in that case, we need to generate several TDs. There they are, TDs. And then retrieve the values for each one of the fields in the record, right? So yeah, so you can render tables, a completely different way of doing it. So if you remember, one of my widgets was the HTML widget, right? The HTML widget allowed developers to type fully formatted HTML content, right? With all the styling of justification, of line numbers and bullets, right? Line items, images, tables. I mean, fully blown wizard. And so that we would store the HTML in the database under this attribute, text attribute, right, of the HTML widget. And if you use when you want to render it in a template, in an EJS template, you could use this. But the default behavior for using that escape sequence would be to escape the HTML, right? Not render the HTML, right? To escape all the special characters, right? The greater than, the less than, escape all those characters and render it using all these escape characters. So we can turn that off and say, no, I don't want you to escape it. I want the raw HTML. Right? That is in this long string. Okay. Okay. Then, what about if one of the features that I had added late last week was the ability of users being able to actually fill out a form, right? If you had a page that had input fields and text areas, the ability of people actually filling out the forms and clicking on submit, right? The implementation was, from an Angular's point of view, using APIs, posting the data, right, and having a web service receive the data and inserting it into the database. Well, how do you do that? How do you do that from an EJS? So in EJS, we're not using Ajax, right? We're not using Angular to do any of this. We don't have web services. What do we? Well, to do the same thing, we would have to actually post the data. page is going to it's embedded inside of this outer form, right? This outer form that any submissions, right, is going to right. And this is a technique that that ASPs used, right? If you remember, ASPs would use something like this, right? They do all the HTML. If you ever looked at the generated source HTML source, you would see that there was always an embedded form, right? An outer form. Everything right after the body tag, ASP would inject a form, right? And inside of that form, it would use it to keep track, to keep the session information, that particular interaction with the user. I'm using a similar technique, right? I'm going to embed all my content, all the widgets, everything. I'm going to embed it in this outer form, right? So that I can then provide a submit if the user has added a button, and then submit everything to the server so that it can be inserted into the database. Very, very similar technique that ASP.NET used, right? Now, URL that I was using from Angular to insert data, right? So the behavior will be the same, right? It will go and insert it into the database. The difference is that in Angular we can configure the navigation, right? Typically using config.js, right? In here route, right? And you route, and it was an entire infrastructure that maps URLs and routes to where should you navigate next, right? It was an entire infrastructure that allowed us to do that. We don't have that here. We don't have any of that here. So how do we configure that we need to go after something happens, where will we want to navigate next? So what I did was I provided, as part of the form, right? As part of the form, I provided a callback URL, a hidden input field that provided a callback URL attribute, name value parameter. Okay. Basically, in this case, I would want to stay in the same page, right? Stay in the same page. And on the server, we could retrieve the callback from the fields in the form. Use it to redirect. Look at that, right? Redirecting, actually navigating to some URL, right? Leaving the page where we are and going to another page, right? Unthinkable when we're using Angular technology. Also, another thing that I wanted to point out is the use of all the fields that are submitted in the form, right, are available on the Node.js side. Okay, all those fields, right, including hidden fields, they're all available in the body as a map, right? So, for instance, here, callback URL, it will be in that. Okay. All right, that's EJS for you. I'm going to leave it here. Please go over it. I'm going to post a couple examples on how I used EJS in my project for web. You can debug the application, but when you want to share it with someone, right? You want to share a link and send it to someone. What I do is that I have a separate EJS application, right, that you keep that URL and they navigate to that EJS application, which looks looks exactly the same as when you run it inside of the Angular application. Anyway, I'll go over that on Thursday. Later today, I'll send an invite for later today and the rest of the week. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Do you have a couple of minutes?